Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining the second speaker series of the bar year. So you think you want to run? My name is Jamie Davis, and I'm currently the Assembly Speaker and the Elections Chair for the YLD. One of my goals this year, really as Speaker, is to increase engagement and participation, not just overall within the division, but really to get people excited about potentially running for office, the governance side as well. And so hopefully by having this speaker series, those that have been thinking about taking a leap and taking a more invested role in the division and in an officer role will feel more inspired or will feel like they have some tools to be successful, and will actually declare after the fall of gavel at the annual meeting and in Chicago, so after annual assembly. With us today, we have some current leaders and former officers of the division serving as our panelists. We have Shanique Moss. She is a former speaker and is currently a representative to the nominating committee for the YLD. We have Sheena Hamilton. She is the one of the current young lawyer representatives for the Board of Governors. We have Christina Lou Rosenberg. She is a former treasurer of the division. We have Anna Romaskaya, who is a former chair of the division and is currently one of the House of Delegate representatives for the YLD. So thank you, panelists, for attending, and thank you for your service to the division. So the format of this speaker series includes, we're going to ask the panelists some questions. I'm going to ask the panelists some questions, and then I really want to open it up to the audience for those that are listening if they have any questions for our former leaders. And then I'll go over some election guidelines for those that are interested in running, and then open it up again. So definitely would like to go in order. Shanique, Sheena, Christina, and Anna regarding answering these questions. If you could just kind of briefly give, in that order, your brief history, right, of your experience in the YLD and other bar associations before you declared your candidacy.
Okay, so this is Shanique Moss. I've been practicing as an attorney for a little over 12 years. Prior to declaring my candidacy for clerk and ultimately speaker, I held a variety of positions within the YLD. I first came to the division by way of my involvement with the State Bar of Michigan Young Lawyers section. My first meeting, I was a delegate for the assembly. After that, I filled out one of the appointment applications for the YLD and to try to get more involved. But I also ended up being, someone resigned who was a current district rep for Michigan, and so I ended up taking over her position. But as I mentioned, I filled out an application, and so shortly thereafter, I ended up being vice director of diversity. I also, after that, I ended up being diversity director. I also responded to kind of a random email that came out, and at the time, one of the YLD chairs initiatives was something called Touch 10,000. So I volunteered to be a host they were doing nationwide meet and greet. So I volunteered to be a host for Michigan. I also volunteered, I responded to a random email from then clerk Myra McKenzie Harris, and she was asking for volunteers to serve on the credentials board for a particular meeting, since many of the credential board members would no longer be able to attend the meeting. So I did that. I also ended up being on her resolutions team prior to that. And so I also, like as I mentioned, I had a lot of experience with the State Bar. So I came up through the Young Lawyers section there. So I served as treasurer, secretary, and I believe I served as chair-elect the year I ended up getting elected to be clerk. So I also was involved with our local affinity bar, which is a, a bar affiliated with the National Bar Association. So I served in leadership for that. It was the Davis Dunning Bar Association. I was also involved in my county bar, serving as the chair of the Young Lawyers section for that. So I feel like I had a lot of different leadership experiences prior to putting my hat in the ring. But so that's kind of like my background, and I'll let someone else talk.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Sheena Hamilton. I am an attorney at Dow Bennett in St. Louis, Missouri, practicing labor and employment law. And I've been practicing for about 10 years. My experience at the state and local level was similar to Shanique's, but not quite as high exposure and high level. I'm also a bar junkie, so I was involved with the Missouri Bar and had completed their leadership academy early on in my career and have focused most of my energy there on my practice group. So I've been involved in the planning of our annual labor employment symposium and been the vice chair of that committee for many years. I'm also a member of our MBA affiliate here. It's called the Mound City Bar Association, and have served on that executive board for a number of years. And now I'm not on that board, but lead our Legal Legends Planning Committee. Also a member of our women's bar of here. It's called the Women Lawyers Association of Greater St. Louis, and have been on that executive board for about 6 years. With respect to the ABA, I started off early in my career as a YLD scholar, so that's always a great introduction, I think, into the division and into the association as a whole. After my scholar year, I was a staff writer for TYL for maybe 2 years, and then transitioned over to the substantive law committees and was vice chair and then chair of the Labor and Employment Committee for YLD. At some point, I received, or we went through a transition as a division where we were moving from some print materials to more online in our communications. So I was one of the few people that had been part of an earlier transition that was similar. So was asked to lead the communications branch at the time. And so I was director of communications for 2 years throughout that transition, which is part of our council. The director level positions is the YLD council. And then after those 2 years, ran for the position that I have now, which is as your young lawyer representative on the ABA Board of Governors, and it's a constitutional representative position. And that is a 3-year term, and I'm about 1.5 years through my 3-year term.
Thank you. Christina?
Sure. Hi, I'm Christina Lou Rosenberg, formerly Christina Lou. So right now I am 12 years out of in practice, and at the time that I ran for treasurer, I was about 6 years out. And at the time that I ran for treasurer, that was the first election for treasurer since they had brought the position back. I guess it had been a separate position maybe 5 or 6 years prior to when I ran. As for my history, I basically double tracked in the ABA, in the YLD and the section of litigation. Let's see here. I was involved, I came through in the YLD through the committees. I was a vice chair for the Women in the Profession committee. That was my first appointment. And then I moved up to committee chair, then was appointed to the diversity team vice director, then was named to committees and liaisons director after that. And then at that time, I ran for treasurer. Simultaneously, I was heavily involved in the sectional litigation and was a committee chair and also a young lawyer leader there, and was also involved in the JIOP, which is the Judicial Intern Opportunity Program, with the sectional litigation. And that's kind of my history and background there.
And Anna?
All right, my turn. Hi, everyone. Anna Roman-Sky here. So YLD ABA-wise, I started, I would say I started a little backwards from the YLD in my leadership. I first started out, my very first engagement, I started out on a host committee when the YLD came to San Diego, and that's my first introduction into YLD. At that time, I was already involved in the tips section of the ABA. So I had already been involved for about a year or so as an attorney in the ABA. Prior to that, I was active in the law student division, so I kind of drank the ABA Kool-Aid early. Got involved in the YLD first host committee, met people, got engaged, got involved. First appointment was as a liaison from the YLD into the tips section. Then next appointment, I was the co-chair of the TIPS committee within the YLD. Then I applied and was miraculously appointed to a co-director of committees and liaisons. So I served as co-director for a year in that capacity. Then the following year, I served on the affiliates team as just an affiliates team member and was also the chief judge of the awards and subgrants team. And then after that, I was the director of the affiliates team. And in that year, I ran for YLD secretary. So was a good number of years, had a couple different roles in the division before I decided to run for secretary. At that time, I was about 7 years in practice when I ran for secretary. On the local level, I was involved, still am, in my county bar association, San Diego County Bar, served as president of our new lawyer division at actually the same time that I was co-chairing committees and liaisons. Then subsequently, I served on the board of directors for our Women's Bar Association, which is called Lawyers Club of San Diego. And then more recently, I served as on the board of directors for our San Diego County Bar Association. After my chair year for the YLD, I served and am still serving my final year as a delegate to the House of Delegates on behalf of the YLD. And currently, I'm just entering my 12th year of practice. So, been a long and fun ride.
Yeah. So it seems like there's like a theme of real consistent engagement in the division and in bar associations and just in general involvement. So it seems like maybe y'all, pretty much the panel had between 6 to 7 years of really getting acclimated, right, in their substantive practice and learning more about the association and the division. So that right there is really interesting. So when we think about running for office, right, when we think, okay, this is really what I want to do, you know, I really want to invest in the division, I really want to help, and I want to make a difference. Can you give me insight on, you know, why you decided to run for office, Shanique?
Well, for me, I have always been interested in policy and also looking for ways to improve the legal profession and the justice system. And I had been involved in leadership with the State Bar of Michigan Representative Assembly, which is our version of the ABA House of Delegates. And when I looked kind of like where I saw my place in the division and where I could make a difference, I thought that having involvement in the policy side of things could make a difference. And I saw being clerk and ultimately speaker as a kind of like an outlet to allow me to do that. One of the things that I wanted to mention and why I was like really involved with bar activities is like when I first started practicing, I worked for the Michigan Department of Attorney General, and because the uh, oversight of the office is so great, we were prevented from doing any other type of uh, legal work. So we couldn't do any pro bono, we couldn't do anything like that. And so for me, like getting involved with bar services or bar associations was kind of like an outlet. And I looked at some of the things that, various bar associations are doing and like the YLD was doing. And I kind of really wanted to be a part of something bigger and kind of helping shape policy of the division and, possibly the larger ABA and possibly actually affecting change through the ABA. So that's kind of why I decided to run for speaker.
And this is Sheena. Um, so the Board of Governors role is pretty unique in my view. It is like all of the constitutional representatives. It's when we send someone from the YLD out to the larger ABA to represent us as a division. Uniquely, though, the Board of Governors is a subsection or a committee of the House that has authority to make decisions for the association as a whole anytime that the House of Delegates is not in session, so long as that action is consistent with prior policy of the House, or not inconsistent, I should say. And it's a huge responsibility, and the House, because the House only meets a couple of times a year, so any other time the board can act. We were at a critical time for the ABA with respect to budget. At that time, just to give some perspective, we'd seen entities, whole entities within the ABA go away by recommendation of the board. We had seen substantive portions of entities go away based on recommendations from the board. And so I think some of our senior leaders in the YLD were a little bit anxious about that role and what we were communicating through it. And I had recently been through an engagement with the board where, as communications director, I faced with the publishing arm of the ABA. So the Board of Governors had issued some guidance that basically said to publishing, cut everything in half. And so every entity was being looked at. And at that time, we had TYL magazine. At that time, it was called the Young Lawyer magazine, or TYL. And we had an affiliate newsletter that was, had been previously in paper. We had all kinds of communications that were going out. And we had to look at that. And the YLD at that time had to reform its budget. With respect to publishing, had to redesign some of its communications tools from paper to online, and ended up taking a staff member from publishing to a line item in the YLD's budget at the time, which, I mean, we're general operations, but that person was in our budget. So we were able to, with the help of many people in the YLD, retain our TYL magazine when many other entities in the ABA were not able to retain their print publications or other books and things like that. So having dealt with that recently, and I think not a lot of positions in the YLD deal with finances or deal with the budget that directly. And now TYL, or at least at the time that I was finishing as communications director, was one of the largest revenue generators for the Young Lawyers Division. So I thought that at that time, the process that we had just gone through as leadership of the YLD lent itself to what was happening with the board. And my platform was letting people on the board and communicating who we are, what we do, and why we matter. And having been in communications and sort of touching all of the entities within the YLD, you know, trying to communicate the good work that we were doing and dealing with this budget issue, I thought that it was an appropriate time to run for this office. And it was important to have someone in that role who had a lot of experience with the YLD and line of sight into the good work that the YLD was doing and could communicate that to the board.
And Christina,
Sure.
can you give us insight?
Yeah. So given the fact that at the time the treasurer role had just opened up for election, I thought this was a great opportunity for me to stretch myself and use my knowledge and skills, especially leveraging my current relationships with other ABA entities and within the YLD to develop new ideas in generating revenue and basically and sponsors to bring in more money, and also to create or at least increased cost efficiency. So I was able to have maybe to at least do an initial review of our current processes to see what we could do to make things more efficient and, you know, cut costs where we could. And I think what really appealed to me was the ability for me to shape the position, because it hadn't been, no one had been in it for a while. So at that point in time, it looked like a great opportunity for me to take my leadership skills and relationships to help lead the division. I would say that just of note, I had no actual budget. I had never been a treasurer. I'd never run a budget, but not to say that you can. Those are not complete disqualifiers. However, it is helpful if you have some budget experience and or have dealt with development and sponsorship packages, packaging, marketing experience. These things can be learned, but I think you'll come in to be able to do more if you have those pieces, if you're going to run for treasurer for the division. So that's why I wanted to run for treasurer at that time.
Perfect. So you really seemed like you were excited about really getting that sponsorship piece and really garnering those sponsorships from corporations and firms.
That's correct.
Yeah. Anna, do you kind of want to give us more insight on your desire when you were declared your candidacy and decided to run and for chair? And
Sure. So at the time when I was considering running, it was really not. It wasn't a flippant decision. It really took a lot of thought for me to decide to do it. I knew that it was going to be contested. I knew who else wanted to run. I knew that the other candidate was a good friend of mine, and so I had to really think long and hard as to why. And honestly, one of my motivating factors for myself was thinking about my time in the ABA, my time involved in the YLD, my leadership experience overall, just kind of globally, and why I thought that I would be the better fit in that particular role. I took a lot of time to really educate myself of what it meant. I'm not going to lie, it wasn't something that I had targeted when I first became involved in the YLD. Frankly, I was kind of intimidated by that position. Everyone that was in the chair line and had served previously as a chair, just they were like celebrities in my eye, frankly. So to think of myself in that role, it really took some time for me to kind of wrap my head around it. And ultimately, I this is sort of in that the lean in time frame, and I was serving on the board for our Women's Bar Association, and I was doing a lot of advocacy about just really stepping up and leaning in and making your voice heard. And I kind of looked deep down at myself and realized that I do a lot of that advocating, but I really need to kind of put myself out there and actually take action and not just talk about it. And so that was really the big motivator for me to actually do it. In terms of my thoughts and goals, I really thought that I could continue the good work of my predecessors and just build upon it. My big theme and drive was focusing. I had my 3 R's campaign: relationships, relevance, resilience. That ultimately was the theme throughout my chair year, really focusing a lot on those aspects, developing relationships, and really honing in our own relevance. We had a big initiative that focused on business development and helping young lawyers really find their own voice and advocate for themselves, and giving them the skills and tools to do that, and really persevering in our own resilience. Big focus on health, from the physical to the mental to the emotional, and kind of all the way around. So I really thought that I can bring all of those elements to the table. I really wanted to do it, and also to sort of put myself out there in the way that I was encouraging others. So that was my motivator, my catalyst, and it was a wild ride, and we'll talk more about kind of some strategies and thoughts, but just really wasn't a light decision, and it took a lot of time, a lot of work. It was literally my second full-time job, the non-paying second full-time job.
Yeah, non-paying.
And so, yeah.
So, okay, so along with it being the second, non-paying full-time job, what are, some skills, right? When we're looking at, when you were looking at in your roles, right, you really were interested. What are some of the skills that you wanted to make sure that you had, right, or that you, before you declare, or what are some skills that you think that every potential candidate should have, right? When, different young lawyers are declaring and coming and calling and getting advice from you, either as a former officer of the division or current, what are some skills that you inform those candidates, or you discuss that you think that are important for every candidate?
Is this Shanique?
Sheena.
Oh.
Shanique, yeah.
Okay. So I think that candidates should really have good organizational skills, because I believe that, like Anna was saying, it could potentially be a second full-time job, especially if you're in a contested election. I think that you should be a great negotiator. So in the event that you are successful in your bid for whatever position that you are running for, that you can get results in a professional manner. I think that you should also have good people skills. I think that's really important for anybody who's thinking about running, because you're going to need your fellow wild ears to vote for you. So I would encourage anyone who's thinking about running to try to get away from just sticking with the same group all the time, and try to get to know others in the division. I think it's also important for anybody who's thinking about running to really kind of dig deep, and this isn't necessarily a skill, but this is just kind of a recommendation, to dig deep as far as why you want the position. and make sure that you're doing it because you want to improve the profession, because you want to improve the division, because you want to make a difference, as opposed to just being something that you put on your resume. Because I think for the people who, I mean, we've had amazing leaders in the YLD, but I think a lot of times it's kind of apparent for people who are just in it for the resume booster they think it may give them, as opposed to somebody who's really committed to improving the division and the profession. I also think that when you're thinking about running, and this is something that I think has changed, like definitely since I've been in the division, I think we've had a lot more contested elections. I think that prior to, I would say, maybe my clerk year, we hadn't had a contested election in maybe like 3 years, or it seemed like maybe 2 or 3 years where there was a contested election. But I feel like there are more contested elections now. And having served over the elections committee for 2 election cycles, I think it's always important to communicate to your fellow, I don't want to say competitor, but whoever is running against you, if you have a contested race, I think it's important to keep the uh, lines of communication open between the two of you, because ultimately one of you will be successful, one of you will not at that particular time. But I think it makes a difference when you can, have a contested race with somebody, and after, it's said and done, you guys can still have a cordial relationship. You guys can still maintain a level of friendship if you've had that before. I think in the past, there have been times when individuals, haven't necessarily kept it cordial, and it's been really toxic at times. And I think that not only affects the people in the race, but I think it affects the division as a whole, when there can't be a level of like civility. And this kind of goes back to kind of what you talk about, Jamie, as far as in assembly, you can disagree, you can be on opposite sides of an issue, you can be on opposite sides of an election, but I think it's important to maintain a certain level of civility and just kind of keep those lines of communication open.
And this is Sheena. I would say, first and foremost, you have to have love for the division. The division is not a vehicle that is intended to take you somewhere. It is a business. And if you want to get something from a business, then you can be a customer. But if you want to lead, then you have to be willing to nurture that business, and you have to want to see it grow. Um, so the first thing you have to look at, I think, as a member of the division is, are you a customer of the ABA or of the division, or do you want to lead in the business in the affairs of the organization? The next thing I think you have to do once you've decided that you want to be a leader is understand the YLD and its history. We're talking about running for office in elected positions, which are senior leadership positions. Um, if you're going to be a senior leader of an entity, you should understand how it operates. Sitting in the assembly, I think, is important. Serving on the council is important. All of the elected positions sit on the council. All of the elected positions have real leadership roles on the council. Many of them, or all of them, sit on the executive committee of the YLD. So I think already understanding what the YLD does, not from an observer's perspective, but from a perspective where you're already leading, I think is important. And understanding the history, you can do that by talking to people who have had the position that you desire previously. You can do that by leading some entity of some arm of the YLD and understanding the history and development of that. You can even read about it. I mean, I'm always soliciting or hawking this book that I don't even think is printed anymore, but I know that the YLD has copies because I got one before I ran, but Jay Ray, a former chair of the YLD, wrote a book that the ABA published about the history of the YLD, and how it came to be and who its officers have been, and things of that nature. I think from those are the sort of underlying skill sets that I think you need to have, is that desire, and a desire in the right places. Um, to go to some of Shanique's points, I think you need to be a person who has relationships in the division already. If the first time that you speak to a person in the division, you're asking them for their support for your candidacy, that can be a little off-putting. Or if the only time that you're talking to a person that you know is to ask them for their support for your candidacy, could be a little off-putting. So having those relationships already where you know you have some built-in support for your candidacy, I think is important. Being approachable is important. Being a builder of consensus, and having an attitude about what you can do for the division and its members versus what the division can do for you. And last, I would just say showing up. You got to be a person who's in the room to lead the meeting. So you got to start showing up before you lead the meeting.
Yeah, those are some really good, really good points there about being authentic, right? Authentically having relationships with people, and not, off-putting, situations or people regarding just walking up to them and speaking to them for the first time. So I think that is right on, Sheena, there on those comments. Christina?
Yeah, and I guess I'll split mine up into specifically for the treasurer, and I think just generally for any potential kind of executive level candidate. Specifically for the treasurer, I think that you definitely need strong development and sponsorship and selling skills. That and the development of relationships, which I think, Sheena and Shanique mentioned about people skills and connections. And it's definitely something that you're going to need as treasurer also, because you're going to need to talk to outside entities, whether they be affiliates, other corporations. So that piece, you are the face of the division in a lot of instances. So that is something that you should, hopefully that's one of your strong suits. Another piece is thinking outside the box and knowing the politics and the pressure points within the broader ABA and how the division is perceived is also key in getting money from the broader ABA, getting our budget passed, and in bringing in other money from outside sources. And more, let's see here. What else do I have? Have a vision and a basic plan and goals for what you want to get done during your term. And I think that goes to your organizational skills and just kind of basic planning. So, you kind of have a blueprint for what you want to do, and so then you can just kind of fill in the logistical or, people that you have to talk to or things that you want to do. If you have sponsorship goals, then you can parse that out in a better way. And I think this is to be treasurer, and I think for any other executive level position, talk to the former people. They can identify the current historical ongoing issues and challenges, and that will help you develop solutions and suggestions, and maybe give you tips on how to communicate that to membership and your voting base, so to speak. This is more towards treasurer also. Have some budget experience, and maybe also this applies to being chair as well. If you've got budget experience, play that up. That's really helpful. And your knowledge of how the ABA generally works. It's not required, but hopefully you've been on council for at least a year or two, and can pick up kind of the major pieces of the ins and outs of our division and it within the broader ABA, which I think is something that Sheena mentioned. Running meetings is really helpful. For treasurer, you have to run finance board. So if you've got experience doing that and can make either your meetings as efficient as possible and as helpful as possible, that is really good. And I think will be helpful, not wasting your time and your members' time, and to walk away with quote unquote homework or things that, so that not every meeting is just kind of a waste of time. That was, I know, one of my pet peeves when I was treasurer and and not wasting the time that we have together, because it's not that much actually when you're at fall or mid-year and annual. Finally, let's see here, some general advice for a potential candidate: have a thick skin. Some of these contested elections are very challenging in that you hear things about you that are personal and can be quite negative, so to speak, and you can constantly be on the defensive, or you can just let it go and to keep moving forward. Be organized on the offset and aggressively plan, but actively listen and constantly be revising your materials and messaging during the campaign as you learn more and more from your support calls. I know all of us, especially Anna, we did a lot of calls during our time. We talked about I had so much talk time. We talk about having a second job. The campaign can be a huge time suck. So just be prepared for it should it happen. I would also recommend that you guys if you intend to run, especially to contested elections that may be challenging, I would pick maybe 2 campaign managers to help you do your legwork. And be very conscientious about who you pick to be your eyes and ears during the campaign. And they can identify people you need to talk to, people that you will talk up, and I think those couple people will be your advisors, basically. My 2 were I wouldn't say lower level, but they were, one was they were folks in the division, but just on the ground, and they did a wonderful job for me and helped me get elected. And finally, pretend you are in a contested election, even if you aren't in one. I had the very exciting history of being uncontested until a week before mid-year, when another candidate dropped in because I think he believed I was weak. I hadn't done very much legwork on the beginning, so I didn't think I needed to since I was uncontested. I was contested for about between February and April, so it was about 3 months. That was the hardest I've ever worked in my entire life. It forces you to get organized, and then if you come out strong at announcement, then people will maybe shy away from trying to run against you. If you are organized, have a plan, and have a lot of support early. So those are kind of my nuts and bolts here.
And Anna, do you have any advice on skills?
Yeah, so a lot of what I would say has been said, and I would just reiterate a couple things that I would add, particularly if you're considering the chair line. First and foremost, you have to be genuine. You have to be you, and you have to do it consistently. So if you are someone who is really bubbly and energetic, that's you. That's who you are. If you're someone who's more introspective and a little bit more reserved, that's you. You don't need to be, the life of the party if that's not your genuine personality. So people see through that, and you have to be genuine, and you have to be consistent in it. If you are carrying yourself a certain way during a meeting or during a sponsored reception, that is the same way you should be when you are out with your friends at a bar. You have to be consistent, and you have to be you. I think another thing, obviously, you got to be professional. Don't be that person late night at the bar dancing on a table. You got to be professional. You're going to be constantly looked at and viewed and screened, and to echo the thick skin, you got to have a thick skin, but you need to be aware of who you are and what you're doing, and that you're just always being watched. And that, I think, goes for just being being an attorney, frankly. That you have to be consistent in that. The other thing that I would say is that you really need to know how to be humble. Even though being an officer appears like it's your show, it's not. It really isn't about you. You're the face of this grand organization, but it is not about you. It is how you lead and motivate your team. And that's really important to know and to do well. The You have to also really have a deep understanding of what's been already done. It's interesting listening to some of the candidate forums, and candidates have these grand ideas about what they want to do and changes they want to make and solve the problems, but you have to also be really aware of the realities and what's been done, what is feasible, what is not, what's in your control, what's not, and really do your homework. Understand the structure of the ABA, not just the YLD, of the ABA. If you were striving to be an officer, a senior leader of the YLD, you need to know where the YLD fits in and how within the bigger ABA. The YLD is not a standalone. It is an entity within an entity. And so that is, as you are considering running, you do your homework and really understand where your vision fits in to the bigger scheme. And then ultimately, you have to know how to be flexible and be okay with being flexible. Understand that you may have these grand visions, but they might not come to fruition. Not for lack of trying, but just sometimes things come up. Sometimes, there's news that happens. Sometimes the ABA changes course, and you just have to roll with it. Sometimes your staff director leaves in the middle of your chair year, and you have to just be malleable and flexible and really work as a team. In terms of advice for potential candidates and when you're considering, I really echo a lot of what Christina said in particular. The biggest thing I would add to it, particularly, really if it's contested or not contested, is just to be aware of how your campaign is trailing. Right now, I think we have 3 contested elections, which means 6 people are going to be reaching out for 3 different positions to all of the YLD members that are active and prospective assembly delegates. That's a lot. Think about it from just an average first or second timer's experience. You have to be aware of how your campaign is going and how you appear to those who don't know anything about the division and are being reached out to. So that can either make or break you for no fault of your own. You can have the best well-intentioned and be the most qualified candidate. But if you're not aware of kind of the bigger picture and how, particularly in the campaign, how you and your fellow candidates are being perceived, that could really be a breaking point. So those are kind of my 2 cents.
Well, I always think it's great to get that insight, right, of what skills, and I think that we always have to remind ourselves that this is we're not getting paid, right? So this is an investment, and due to the investment that you're going to make, right, with running or even serving as an officer, that there will be, some trying times. You might not get everything that you want accomplished, but, you are serving the greater good of the division, right? And so I think it's always great to get that insight. So,
Jamie,
members of
I'm
the
sorry.
panel.
Sorry, this is Anna. I just wanted to throw one thing to kind of as a
Yes.
last point. I just thought of this, but I thought it was important. As you are considering running, whether it's for the chair line, the speaker line, or one of the constitutional reps positions, you really need to be, when I say aware, also aware of yourself, of where your life is. Understand that this is a big time investment, and it's a huge investment that's going to affect your family. It's going to affect your work. It's going to affect your life. And whether your election is contested or not, that year that you are declaring, you are serving in your role that you've been appointed to, and you need to do a good job in it. Plus, see the future and try to set yourself up for that position that you're seeking. So you need to think long and hard on where your life is and whether you could make sometimes that 1 year commitment, sometimes it's a 4 year commitment. If you're in the chair line, that's a 4 year commitment, your election year plus your 3 year secretary, your chair elect, and your chair year. So it's 4 years of your life that you should project the best you can and whether you can truly make that investment. So just wanted to add that piece.
No, I think that's great, right? Because a lot of times people don't think big picture, and they just think, okay, yeah, I want to run. I have a lot of time on my hands, and life will deal you one, right? You might move, you might start a new job, and all of that you want to take into consideration because even if your life changes, the responsibilities and roles and expectations of your position stays the same. You're still going to be required to do your best work. So it's very, very important that we know that. So for the panel, is there any other last advice or anything for potential candidates about running a campaign or anything else that you can think of before I open it up for questions from those that are listening?
Just really quick, I wanted to mention that, and kind of echo what Sheena was saying about like talking to past leaders, trying to get, I think it's important to do that. I think it's also important to try to get to know as much about the division as you can. If you're thinking about running for any elected position, I mean, you must start with like reviewing the bylaws. You should also like look at past council meeting minutes to see kind of like who is doing what were people doing back in the day. You know, you should look at that type of stuff. You should also review the election guidelines to see, you know, the rules for running an election and what your responsibilities and what guidelines that you have to adhere to. I also think that's important if you are thinking about running for something, and like actually when you start running, when you put your name in the hat to run for something, I think at that point, I think it's the time. I mean, a lot of times you go to the meetings and they're in cool places you've never been, and you want to go sightseeing, so you miss a whole bunch of uh, seminars. You don't go to like maybe some of the receptions that are there. But I think that's like a missed opportunity. If you are running for something, you should make it your priority to be at as much of the meetings, as much of the events that are happening at the conferences and meetings as you can. I think that's important.
And this is Sheena. I wanna track what Anna said and add a little bit to that. I mean, it's really, really important that this fits with your life, right? And and Anna's talking about some of the family life, but also professionally, you with your job need to ensure that you either one, have the support of your employer, or two, are in a position to take the time you need to be successful in your role, sort of irrespective of what your employer's view may be or mixed view may be of your role. The Board of Governors is a 3-year term with 6 meetings a year, and some of those meetings are 6 days at a time. The first person I talked to who had this role before me, who had been a communications director and had been the YLD rep to the board, said, you have to be prepared to take a step back from the profession to do a good job in this role, which I thought, was absurd. But in reality, it is that sort of time commitment. So you need to be aware of that and be in position to be successful with that kind of expectation.
And then this is Christina. I'll also just echo the fitting of these positions within your life, but also know that there are financial costs also, because not everything is reimbursed. Between the time, the money, and your family, there's a lot of service that goes into being in senior leadership. When I was exploring running, I was also looking at possibly running for secretary that year. Basically, it was the same year that Anna ran. It just, at that point, and that track, it didn't fit in my life, but with all of the weighing all of the pros and the cons from it, treasurer actually was a wonderful position for me at the time. And it wasn't it didn't have to become my full-time job, so to speak. I could have a real job that made money and also serve the division in a nice balanced position. And separate from that, my last piece on kind of electioning, or basically running an election, if you can do basically a national election on this scale, you can basically run for anything after this. It's actually a wonderful kind of like microcosm of what running for any elected office look like. And this can be your primer for anything. And I definitely think that going through a contested election at this level is a great confidence booster. Should you want to run or go into politics in any form down the line. And then also, I had given advice to some other candidates who came after me that were kind of looking at the attitude of candidates, and just know that you are selling yourself and that you're trying to get their votes, not the other way around. And so don't become defensive if people don't like you, but you're constantly working for the voter, and just which is the member, and know where they're coming from, and know that you have varying degrees of familiarity with the division, the history, and engagement. So just that kind of goes along the lines with Anna's notes on awareness about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and who you are trying to attract to get to vote for you. And that's my last piece.
Yeah. No, I think it's great, right? We this is why I wanted to have the speaker series, so that we can, have honest dialogue and ask some questions. So this is what we're going to do. Due to all of the great comments from our panelists, I will do another speaker series where I will go over the election guidelines and allow those to ask me questions. So I will do that at a later date. We only have 3 more minutes left in the speaker series today, so I wanted to open it up to anyone that has questions that are listening, to our panelists or to me, so we can answer those questions and get those answers.
So if we don't have any questions, I did have one more positive note that I kind of wanted to end on from my perspective. This is Sheena. We talked about the big, huge commitment that you make in running for an officer position, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention the incredible and sort of undeniable dividends that you get from serving this division, the relationships that you build, the people that you have the opportunity to meet are the absolute cream of the crop in our profession. The opportunities that are presented to you, sometimes solely based on your role, and the really work that you get to do, that you're blessed to do, and as a benefit to our profession and improving, our industry, is really, really gratifying. And I didn't want to kind of go through all of those potential cons without mentioning those pros.
No, I think that's great. Any questions? Okay. Seeing none, I definitely wanted to thank our panelists again for their time. I think that this was very, very informative, and we appreciate you just investing in our young lawyers and giving them more insight for when they want to run and declare. So I definitely appreciate the panelists. I wanted to thank all those that joined the call for taking the time to listen and to join the speaker series. And once again, I will have another speaker series to go a little bit further into the election guidelines and to answer any questions that we might have for those that are interested in running. Again, thank you to those that attended, and thank you for the panelists for giving your tidbits, your nuggets to us as well. Thank you, and have a great day.